Finally, I am at episode 50 of the Angry Clean Energy Guy. And today, this podcast will be a slightly longer version of a TEDx talk I gave at the National Gallery of Singapore in late April 2021. Welcome to episode 50 of the Angry Clean Energy Guy with me, Asad Razouk. I am so happy you're here. Thank you. Imagine climate change pummels Indonesia hard. Tsunamis, floods, landslides, drought, earthquakes, sea level rise. Indonesians start to leave. A few at first, then thousands and tens of thousands on makeshift boats. Right now, 20 million are congregating around Singapore in need of shelter, food, water. Millions more are heading to Australia, overwhelmed by nature. Similar events unfold in the Mediterranean Sea, at the gates of Europe, and on the Mexico-US border, where millions of African, Arabs, Southeast Asians, and Latin American climate refugees turn up. What are Singapore, Australia, Europe, America going to do? Are they going to shoot them? Are they going to let them in? Are they going to finish Trump's wall, but this time take it all around their countries? But what happened, you might ask? What happened was we delivered progress without sustainability. Over the past 200 years, we've delivered amazing progress, in no small part because of how much oil, gas, and coal we burned. We doubled global life expectancy. We conquered illiteracy and became an emoji world. We reduced infant mortality from 50% in 1800 to 2.9% globally today. Every one of you has more information in their pocket than Abraham Lincoln had access to his entire life. But we cooked the books while building this progress. How bad is it? Every single earnings number for every single company in the world is wrong. And it's wrong for a very simple reason. We are not pricing environmental destruction. Now, at the beginning, we did not know we were cooking the books. In 1882, the world's first coal-fired power station, the Edison Electric Light Station, was built and commissioned in London. It lit up the town, powered the telegram, and generally made people's lives better. We then built a global infrastructure based on burning oil, gas, and coal, and improved lives and livelihoods at a beautiful moment in time. We did not know then that we were cooking the books, but we did at least 40 years ago. In fact, a United Nations body called the IPCC says we've known about our impact on Earth's climate for more than 100 years. But I want to be generous today. In 1982, Exxon, the oil company, Exxon's internal scientific papers showed beyond a doubt that we knew for sure that CO2 warmed the planet, and that when we produced oil, gas, and coal, then burned these, a certain number of CO2 emissions were generated, which we could calculate precisely. And guess what we did about that? Nothing, by and large. Emissions are still rising to this day, and we're still cooking the books. And guess what? We put together very creative ways to do that. First, companies and governments and lobbyists buried the truth about our impact on the climate. Then they argued that how could they possibly estimate their impact on climate change if governments didn't force them to adopt a carbon price, or didn't tax carbon, or didn't force them to clean up their mess, whether it's plastic or oil and gas wells. And they did nothing. Most recently, though, we came up with something even better to continue to cook the books, and it's called ESG. ESG refers to the environmental, social, and governance risks embedded in a business, and it's about cataloging them. The idea is to spread information about the ESG risks embedded in a company's business, because these might affect the performance of that business. And I'll give you an example. Right now, if you want to look at the value of real estate anywhere in the world, you would rely on financial statements that show the profitability of that real estate. But there is nothing in these financial statements that takes into account the sea level rise investment, for example, needed to defend these properties, the deforestation, if any, associated with building that project, or the cost in terms of CO2 of the project. And so, what ESG does is it gives you a beautiful ESG report cataloging some of these risks without either putting a number on them or deducting these costs from the profitability of the real estate. In other words, the ESG catalog is a lot of blah, blah, blah to say, in order to feel better about cooking the books, we're going to have a huge bucket for everything not on a company's balance sheet or earnings. Then we are going to ignore them in looking at profits. Now, how good is that? You've got to admire the deception. And as a feel-good factor, ESG is so good that ESG investing has become a huge business. From about a zero market share of assets under management 10 years ago, ESG labeled funds today are about $1 out of each 3 professionally managed dollars. And I think they're going to go up to 100% because why not? That's 100% of professionally managed assets under management worldwide. But there are at least 4 big problems with ESG, and we need to talk about them. The first one, which I discussed more extensively in episode 49 of the Angry Clean Energy Guy, is that there are no universal rules. Instead, there are extremely elaborate spreadsheets from a multitude of ESG framework providers that you can arbitrage between to jot down all your ESG risks, then publish them in a beautiful report. Maybe. The second problem is that inconsistencies and abuse are rife. For example, deforestation is a major driver of climate change. You would think it's being used as a filter to ensure companies in ESG labeled funds are not turning a blind eye to deforestation. But you would be wrong. 78% of mutual fund providers offered ESG investments, but none specifically excluded deforestation risk. 0. Not a single one actively priced climate risk either. 0. Problem number 3 is that epic, and I mean epic, greenwashing is everywhere. For example, out of 253 funds that switched to an ESG focus in 2020 in the United States, 87% of them rebranded by adding words like sustainable or ESG or green or climate to their names. But not a single one changed their stock or bond holdings at that point. Now that's got to be ridiculous. Another example is courtesy of the largest investment manager in the world, BlackRock. BlackRock recently launched its wonderfully named the BlackRock US Carbon Transition Readiness ETF, just this month, April 2021. And the ETF broke funding records on its first trading day, raising $1.25 billion. But that fund, that ETF, makes a mockery of ESG because it holds world champions of stopping decarbonization, including Exxon, Chevron, Conoco, and Marathon Oil. And not just that, it's actively invested in companies involved in rainforest destruction, for example. And that's the BlackRock Carbon Transition Fund. But the fourth problem with ESG is literally potentially lethal. ESG is about disclosure and reporting information. So that's companies informing us about their environmental, social, and governance risks. But disclosure and reporting is not the same thing as doing something. It's certainly not the same thing as counting anything at all. When auditors sign off on financial statements, this is pretty much valid for every company in the world that's audited. These financial statements have these words by the auditors. In our opinion, the financial statements referred to above present fairly in all material respects the financial position and the results of operations and cash flows of XYZ company. These words that auditors use, present fairly in all material respects, may be the most dangerous words in the English language at the moment. Why? Because they put you to sleep. That's why. They give you the impression that the numbers we read and base our entire 200 trillion capital markets on are correct. Except they're not. The G in ESG, governance, is about corporate actions and behaviors. The S in ESG is about human capital. I guess it's fine for these to be cataloged, and we definitely need to understand them to assess corporate risk. But the E in ESG, environmental, must be priced. No way environmental destruction shouldn't be accounted for. In other words, destroying the environment and polluting free of charge cannot just be a disclosure and reporting issue. And what we're talking about are not small details. The global corporate sector causes $7.6 trillion of damage to the environment each year, mostly because of three buckets: the emission of greenhouse gases, the disposal of unrecycled waste in landfills, and the discharge of untreated water. So in fact, it probably causes a lot more damages than $7.6 trillion, but $7.6 trillion are the damages from these three buckets. And take climate change as a subset. Exxon, the oil company, tells us its 2019 emissions were equivalent to 730 million tons of CO2. Now, the social cost of carbon, so that's how much damage in dollars 1 ton of CO2 emitted into the atmosphere causes, is estimated to be anywhere from $50 to $200. The Biden administration, for example, currently puts it at $51. So let's be generous. At $50, if you do the math, Exxon is missing from its financial statements $36.5 billion in costs. That's $50 times 730 million tons of CO2. In a great year, Exxon makes about $20 billion. But it does not include the $36.5 billion of climate damage it causes because it's not paying it. But you are, we are, through the catastrophic climate change that we have already banked. So if we were not cooking the numbers, we would be able to see that Exxon is losing an enormous amount of money each year. Over 40 years, across the coal, oil, and gas industries, you're talking about trillions of funding, which could have moved us to a safer planet much faster. We probably would have already been there. But instead, we used those trillions to keep looking for more gas, more coal, more oil, to keep producing more plastic and polluting stuff, and to keep paying everybody doing it very handsomely. And this applies to every single company in the world. Take BASF, for example, the largest chemical producer in the world. BASF is misstating its earnings by 67% if you do the same exact math that I just did for Exxon. So take its profits in any given year, take its emissions, the ones it says it's responsible for, multiply these by $50, deduct them from their earnings, and you'll see that the earnings are a third of what they look like. Toyota is misstating its earnings by 100%. Toyota's never been profitable, in other words, if it was accounting for its environmental impact. And you can see the problem, I hope. We have to fix ESG before it's too late. Companies must price environmental destruction, because then far more money would flow to the right places far faster, which is exactly what we need in a climate emergency. Your electric boiler upgrade would suddenly look like a bargain compared to keeping your gas boiler. Green hydrogen would be cheaper than fossil hydrogen very fast. Greener steel would be already here, maybe even electric airplanes. Plastic bottles would disappear. What Bill Gates calls the green premium, so that's the extra you have to pay for a zero carbon product compared to a fossil fuel product equivalent. So, for example, the extra you have to pay for a biodegradable straw compared to a plastic straw. So, Bill Gates's green premium would melt away and disappear. As a matter of fact, there is no green premium unless we are cooking the books. So, what do we do about all this? Well, obviously, first, we've been waiting for governments for 40 years now to force a carbon price through so that everybody pays for their greenhouse gas emissions. And I mean every single company in the world. But while waiting for governments and regulators to muster the courage to do the right thing, we need investors to do this work on their own. It's just math, and they can price environmental destruction on their own, like grown-ups. We also need good companies to take the lead and just do it. Good companies should account in dollars for their environmental impact and should show their earnings somewhere in their financial statements after these impacts. And they should also compensate their executives according to these revised, corrected earnings. We need accountants to wake up and stop signing off on fictional financial statements which don't show carbon emissions and environmental destruction. At the moment, the accountants are simply forgetting the financial costs of climate change and environmental destruction and basically signing off on misstated earnings worldwide. They're fueling the cooking the books pandemic, and they need to shape up. But this is not just about governments and regulators and investors and companies and accountants. Every single one of us has the power to change the world. Start new research firms, for example, that issue for the 1,000 largest companies in the world restated earnings that show their pollution costs, their hidden environmental costs, etc., and then spread from these research companies the information so that it becomes the basis on which companies are judged and the basis on which executives are paid and stocks are traded. Or meanwhile, effect change where you work so that your research firms start publishing real, honest numbers. Stopping this cooking the books pandemic is probably the single most powerful step to change the world, and fast. Then you would have created one that merges progress with sustainability, and one where we would have saved tens of millions or even hundreds of millions of lives. Indonesians, Africans, Arabs, South Asians, Latin Americans don't want to move to Sweden or Denmark. They really don't. If everyone has a safe place to live, then moving becomes a choice. No one would be forced to leave their home. Meanwhile, every company today, no exceptions, is capitalizing profits and leaving its impact on the environment for everyone else to pay for. On that note, thank you so much for listening to this episode 50 of the Angry Clean Energy Guy with me, Asad Razouk. If you like the show, please remember to rate, to share, to review, and have a great couple of weeks.